The first awakening echoes in the Paleolithic dawn. The world was not silent then. It hummed. It breathed. It was a vast living creature of rock and shadow, and the earliest humans, our ancestors, knew this with a certainty that ran deeper than bone. Their lives were stark, a daily wager against the harshness of the Upper Paleolithic, a time when the great mammoths still shook the plains and Ice Age glaciers sculpted the continents. But their spirits were not stark, they were intensely dramatically alive. Imagine, if you will, a clan gathered around a fire in the mouth of a deep cave, perhaps 40,000 years ago. Their names are lost to time, but we can call the elder the one whose eyes held the most fire, Uman. Uman was not a chief in the way of kings, but a chief of vision. His authority came from a place beyond the visible world, from the shadows that danced on the cave walls, the whispers of the wind, and the unnerving mystery of what happens after. The unbearable mystery of silence. The genesis of animism, the belief that a spirit or soul inhabits all things, not just people, but the roaring river, the towering cliff, and the great bear, likely began with three simple, unsettling human experiences: the dream, the echo, and the death. Consider the dream. A hunter, exhausted after a long day, closes his eyes. In his sleep, he rises from his slumbering body. He walks, he runs, he hunts a stag with his dead father by his side. When he wakes, his body has not moved yet, his mind has traveled miles. What was it that left him this second self, this fleeting invisible companion? Uman and his people named it the soul, a separate spiritual essence. Then came the echo. Uman stands at the mouth of a chasm and shouts a warning or a challenge. A moment later, the mountain shouts back, using his very voice. He is alone, yet a voice answers. It is a powerful, inescapable conclusion. The mountain, the great unmoving entity of stone, is listening. It is speaking. It has a consciousness that mirrors his own. But the most potent birth of this spiritual awareness was death. When the hunter is struck down, his body remains warm at first, then terribly cold. His strength, his warmth, his fire, his breath, the things that made him him, are gone. Where did they go? They did not vanish. They simply changed states. The soul, the Ka or Ba, as later Egyptians would name it, had departed on a journey. And so the world suddenly expanded. It was no longer just the solid ground they walked on. It was also the vast, invisible realm of the departed spirits. The sacred red and the journey of the dead. The first clear evidence of this profound shift in human thought comes from the Upper Paleolithic burial rituals. When a hunter named Tor suddenly succumbed, his body was not abandoned. It was a sacred event. Uman directed his people to cover Tor's body, his once vibrant shell, with a rich, deep red powder, red ochre. This ochre, made from iron oxide, was more than decoration. To the Paleolithic mind, it was the color of blood, the very essence of life force. By coating the body in this vibrant pigment, the living were symbolically restoring the life that had been lost. They were acknowledging the soul's journey and trying to ensure its power was maintained. Sometimes a corpse would be carefully interred with practical tools, like a flint blade or a necklace of shell beads. Why would a dead man need tools? Because the dead man was not truly dead. He was merely journeying to another plane, a spirit world, and he would need sustenance and defense on his eternal path. This was the first, most dramatic physical manifestation of animistic belief. The afterlife is a continuation of this life, only in a different invisible dimension. The walls that whispered. The art of the spirit hunters. The most arresting testament to the Paleolithic mind's spiritual awakening lies within the deep, silent chambers of the caves. Places like Lascaux in France or Altamira in Spain. These were not living spaces. They were cathedrals of rock, and their walls hold a breathtaking gallery of animals: bison, aurochs, horses, and mammoths rendered with stunning vitality. Uman and the other elders did not paint these massive, vibrant beasts for mere aesthetics. They were communicating with the very spirit of the animal. This was not simply hunting magic meant to grant power over the physical creature. It was an act of profound spiritual respect, a communion. The animal's spirit was immortal, and by rendering its image deep within the earth in a place that mimicked the womb or the chasm of the underworld, the artists were acknowledging the animal's powerful conscious soul. They were entering a spiritual contract. We take your life for ours, but we honor your spirit and ask that it return to us in the next season. Look closely at the most mysterious images. Alongside the perfectly rendered beasts are strange hybrid figures. A man with the head of a bison, a human figure with antlers. These are often interpreted as shamans, the first priests, the first professionals of the spirit world. The shaman, through trance, perhaps induced by rhythmic sound or intense meditation in the cave's utter darkness, would journey into the spirit world, the realm where all the animal souls and the ancestral spirits resided. For Uman's people, the world was a thin membrane separating the visible from the invisible. The great bison on the wall was not a memory. It was the spirit of bison itself, a powerful entity that controlled the hunt. The hunter's success depended not on his strength alone, but on his ability to honor this spirit, to speak to the conscious, animated forces of nature. The earth itself, the cave, the river, the standing stones was alive. Every ripple, every shadow, every roar of thunder was an expression of a deliberate will, a powerful spirit being who could be appeased, honored, or angered. This was the first awakening, the dramatic moment when humanity looked at the vast, wild world and saw not just matter but a complex, conscious, vibrant network of souls, a truly ancient faith, an intimate connection that held life and death in perfect spiritual balance. I'd be happy to continue the journey into the heart of ancient animism. The first awakening echoes in the Paleolithic dawn. The world was not silent then. It hummed. It breathed. It was a vast, living creature of rock and shadow, and the earliest humans, our ancestors, knew this with a certainty that ran deeper than bone. Their lives were stark, a daily wager against the harshness of the Upper Paleolithic, a time when the great mammoths still shook the plains and Ice Age glaciers, sculpted the continents. But their spirits were not stark. They were intensely, dramatically alive. Imagine, if you will, a clan gathered around a fire in the mouth of a deep cave, perhaps 40,000 years ago. Their names are lost to time, but we can call the elder, the one whose eyes held the most fire, Uman. Uman was not a chief in the way of kings, but a chief of vision. His authority came from a place beyond the visible world, from the shadows that danced on the cave walls, the whispers of the wind, and the unnerving mystery of what happens after. The unbearable mystery of silence. The genesis of animism, the belief that a spirit or soul inhabits all things, not just people, but the roaring river, the towering cliff, and the great bear, likely began with three simple, unsettling human experiences: the dream, the echo, and the death. Consider the dream. A hunter, exhausted after a long day, closes his eyes. In his sleep, he rises from his slumbering body. He walks, he runs, he hunts a stag with his dead father by his side. When he wakes, his body has not moved yet, his mind has traveled miles. What was it that left him this second self, this fleeting invisible companion? Uman and his people named it the soul, a separate spiritual essence. Then came the echo. Uman stands at the mouth of a chasm and shouts a warning or a challenge. A moment later, the mountain shouts back, using his very voice. He is alone, yet a voice answers. It is a powerful, inescapable conclusion. The mountain, the great unmoving entity of stone, is listening. It is speaking. It has a consciousness that mirrors his own. But the most potent birth of this spiritual awareness was death. When the hunter is struck down, his body remains warm at first, then terribly cold. His strength, his warmth, his fire, his breath. The things that made him are gone. Where did they go? They did not vanish. They simply changed states. The soul, the Ka or Ba, as later Egyptians would name it, had departed on a journey. And so the world suddenly expanded. It was no longer just the solid ground they walked on. It was also the vast, invisible realm of the departed spirits, the sacred red, and the journey of the dead. The first clear evidence of this profound shift in human thought comes from the Upper Paleolithic burial rituals. When a hunter named Tor suddenly succumbed, his body was not abandoned. It was a sacred event. Uman directed his people to cover Tor's body, his once vibrant shell, with a rich, deep red powder red ochre. This ochre made from iron oxide was more than decoration. To the Paleolithic mind, it was the color of blood, the very essence of life force. By coating the body in this vibrant pigment, the living were symbolically restoring the life that had been lost. They were acknowledging the soul's journey and trying to ensure its power was maintained. Sometimes a corpse would be carefully interred with practical tools, like a flint blade or a necklace of shell beads. Why would a dead man need tools? Because the dead man was not truly dead. He was merely journeying to another plane, a spirit world, and he would need sustenance and defense on his eternal path. This was the first most dramatic physical manifestation of animistic belief. The afterlife is a continuation of this life, only in a different invisible dimension. The walls that whispered, the art of the spirit hunters. The most arresting testament to the Paleolithic mind's spiritual awakening lies within the deep, silent chambers of the caves. Places like Lascaux in France or Altamira in Spain. These were not living spaces. They were cathedrals of rock, and their walls hold a breathtaking gallery of animals, bison, aurochs, horses, and mammoths rendered with stunning vitality. Uman and the other elders did not paint these massive, vibrant beasts for mere aesthetics. They were communicating with the very spirit of the animal. This was not simply hunting magic meant to grant power over the physical creature. It was an act of profound spiritual respect, a communion. The animal's spirit was immortal, and by rendering its image deep within the earth in a place that mimicked the womb or the chasm of the underworld, the artists were acknowledging the animal's powerful, conscious soul. They were entering a spiritual contract. We take your life for ours, but we honor your spirit and ask that it return to us in the next season. Look closely at the most mysterious images. Alongside the perfectly rendered beasts are strange hybrid figures. A man with the head of a bison, a human figure with antlers. These are often interpreted as shamans, the first priests, the first professionals of the spirit world. The shaman, through trance, perhaps induced by rhythmic sound or intense meditation in the cave's utter darkness, would journey into the spirit world, the realm where all the animal souls and the ancestral spirits resided. For Uman's people, the world was a thin membrane separating the visible from the invisible. The great bison on the wall was not a memory. It was the spirit of bison itself, a powerful entity that controlled the hunt. The hunter's success depended not on his strength alone, but on his ability to honor this spirit, to speak to the conscious, animated forces of nature. The earth itself, the cave, the river, the standing stones was alive. Every ripple, every shadow, every roar of thunder was an expression of a deliberate will, a powerful spirit being who could be appeased, honored, or angered. This was the first awakening, the dramatic moment when humanity looked at the vast, wild world and saw not just matter but a complex, conscious, vibrant network of souls. A truly ancient faith and intimate connection that held life and death in perfect spiritual balance. I'd be happy to continue the journey into the heart of ancient animism. The soul of the river Egypt's divine Nile. The cold, boundless world of the Siberian hunter demanded that the spirit be sought in the movement of life, the elusive reindeer, the soaring eagle. But thousands of miles to the south, the entire world narrowed to a single liquid certainty, the Nile River. For the people of ancient Egypt, there was no chasing the spirits across the tundra. The spirits simply arrived every year with the flood. This was the second great spiritual realization of the animistic age, when life is no longer about pursuit, but about the gift of the land. The spiritual focus shifts to the eternal forces that sustain the place itself. Here in this green ribbon carved across the desert, the spiritual contract changed from one of reincarnation to one of renewal. The unseen power of Hapi. The people named their home the Two Lands, but it was truly only one dictated by the river. Without the inundation, the annual predictable flood that coated the valley in fertile black silt, There was only rock and sand. The Nile was not a geographical feature, it was a god. The spirit of the flood was Hapi, a curious, benevolent deity, often depicted with the full, heavy breasts of a bountiful woman and the flowing beard of a man, his body intertwined with water plants. He was the personification of the river's life force. But even Hapi was merely the face of a larger truth: the Nile possessed a soul. To the Egyptians, the world was filled with various forms of spiritual energy. Every person had a Ka, the life force, the spirit double that was born with you, and needed sustenance in the afterlife. And they had a Be, the soul that was free to move, often depicted as a human-headed bird, which flew between the tomb and the living world. The river, the sun, the field, they all possessed an essential functional energy, a Ka that made them what they were. The river's Ka was life renewal and the constant flow of existence. To honor this powerful, life-giving soul, the Egyptians did not merely sacrifice an animal. They had to pay tribute to the cycle itself. The annual festival of the inundation was the centerpiece of their spiritual year, a time of joyous celebration where priests measured the rising waters with a device called a nilometer, charting Hapi's generosity. They offered gifts to the current, food flowers, and tiny clay boats, not to bribe the river, but to feed its Ka and acknowledge the gift of the fertile black earth. Sobek and the animal embodiments. Just as the river was a god, so too were the creatures who lived within and around it. Unlike in the north, where the hunter apologized to the spirit of his prey, here, the spiritual power often manifested in the protection of certain species. The most formidable of the river spirits was the crocodile. This monstrous reptile, with its terrifying speed and silent ambush, was the embodiment of the river's sheer raw power. The people did not hate this danger. They reverenced it. To tame such a force, they elevated it. The crocodile god Sobek was a figure of immense strength, fertility, and sudden dangerous power. In some temples, like those at Komombo Live, crocodiles were kept adorned with jewels and pampered as living icons of the god, their mundane lives, transcending the animal to become a sanctuary for the divine Ba. The spiritual reverence extended to all parts of the environment. The ibis and the baboon became sacred to Thoth, the god of wisdom, writing, and knowledge. These creatures of the marsh and desert fringe were deemed observant and clever. Their form an appropriate vessel for the mind of the divine scribe. The cat, so effective at protecting grain stores from rodents, was seen as the gentle yet fierce protector of the home and a connection to the sun. It became the favorite form of Bastet, the goddess of joy and domesticity. The bull and the cow, the tireless engines of agriculture, embodied the strength of fertility and the motherly sky. Apis, the sacred bull of Memphis, was a living god on earth, identified by his specific markings, and his life was watched over by a cult of dedicated priests. The Egyptians' animism was a practical and highly ritualized faith. If the river flowed and the crops grew, the contract was being honored. If the sacred cat was safe, if the crocodile was venerated, and if the bull was kept well, the soul of the land remained in a state of Mayat cosmic order and balance. Their deities were not remote figures dwelling in a distant heaven, but immediate forces present in the air, the field, and the water. They were gods of the here and now, bound to the great life-giving river, requiring daily attention and devotion. It was a worship born from an eternal gift, a spiritual realization that in a harsh world, stability was the highest form of the divine. Of course, let us shift our focus from the predictable rhythms of the Nile to the dramatic, often terrifying spirit world of ancient Mesopotamia. Whispers in the cedar forest, Mesopotamian tree spirits. In the fertile crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the spiritual landscape was defined less by the gentle, life-giving flow of a single river like the Nile, and more by the constant, demanding negotiation with a multitude of specific, localized spirits. The Mesopotamians, the Sumerians, Akkadians, and Babylonians were the world's first great city builders, and they understood that for every triumph of civilization, There was a spiritual cost paid to the wild conscious world they had conquered. Their form of animism evolved beyond the simple worship of life-giving forces to include a pervasive awareness of spirit of place and a host of powerful, often malevolent intermediate entities. The guardian of the sacred wood. Humbaba, the most famous and perhaps the most ancient representation of animistic consciousness in Mesopotamia, is captured in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the world's oldest surviving literary masterpiece. This epic tells the story of the king of Uruk, Gilgamesh, and his companion Enkidu journeying to the Cedar forest. This forest, a rich, fragrant expanse of towering trees in what is now Lebanon, was not merely a source of prized timber. It was a sacred domain, a piece of the untouched wild heart of the world, and it was alive. Its soul was protected by a terrifying guardian, Humbaba or Huwawa in Sumerian. Humbaba was the very embodiment of the forest's conscious wrath. When he roared, it was the sound of a storm. When he spoke, it was fire. He wore 7 coats of spiritual armor, his terrifying melem that covered him in an aura of dazzling, terrifying splendor. He was not a god in the highest pantheon of Anu or Enlil, but a giant, monstrous, localized nature spirit placed there by the high gods to ensure that the vital, sentient essence of the trees remained untouched by human hands. Gilgamesh's quest to cut down the cedars and slay Humbaba was in a spiritual sense humanity's first great war against animism, the struggle of civilization against the conscious wilderness. By killing the forest spirit guardian, Gilgamesh gained prestige and materials, but he incurred a cosmic debt. He violated the sacred consciousness of the place, an act that directly led to the death of his friend Enkidu and his own eventual existential despair. This story served as a potent, dramatic warning. To injure the conscious soul of the world is to invite disaster. The Utuku and the whispers in the house. While the high gods like Enlil, god of the wind and earth, and Enki, god of water and wisdom, were the remote rulers of the cosmos, the daily lives of the Mesopotamian people were governed by thousands of lesser, more intimate spirits. Every city, house, and object had its specific spirit or Numina, much like later Roman beliefs. But it was the terrifying presence of the malevolent spirits, the demons, that truly defined their spiritual experience. These beings were the shadow side of animism's souls that had become twisted and vengeful. The most feared were the Ekemu and the Utuku. The Ekemu were the vengeful ghosts of the improperly buried or those who died without proper offerings. Because their physical remains lacked the necessary ritual attention, their soul could not rest in the dreary underworld, the Kur. They were forced to roam the earth, thirsting for life force, often possessing the bodies of the living. The Utuku were a broader class of spirits, usually evil, who lived in desolate, remote, or ruined places, the dark corners, the deserts, the hidden gaps in civilization. They could cause disease, madness, or sudden misfortune. These spirits were the precursor to later Arabian jinn, invisible shape-shifting entities dwelling in hidden places, ready to lash out at humankind. This profound fear of the environment's conscious hostility led to a sophisticated system of magical protection, the rituals of appeasement and protection. Life in a Mesopotamian city was a careful dance to keep the physical world and the conscious spirit world aligned. To appease the vengeful or dangerous spirits, the priests, the Ashipu exorcists, and the Baru diviners developed complex rituals. Amulets and figures. Clay figures of protective spirits were often buried in the walls or under the threshold of a house to ward off the evil Utuku. 2. Incantations. Written charms and spoken prayers were used constantly to petition the good spirits or compel the bad ones to leave a person or a place. 3. The me. The greatest spiritual principle was the me, pronounced me, the set of divine decrees that governed all aspects of existence, from the way a temple was built to the art of weaving. The me were the spiritual laws that defined the conscious essence of every thing and idea. To misuse a tool to betray a friend or to cut down a sacred tree was to violate the me, to disrupt the spiritual order of the universe. Thus, in ancient Mesopotamia, Animism was less a quiet reverence for nature and more an intense dramatic struggle for spiritual survival. The world was alive, but its living parts, the mountains, the rivers, the forests, and the very air were capricious, often dangerous, and always demanded profound respect. The success of their magnificent cities depended entirely on the daily acknowledgement and appeasement of these restless, conscious forces. The mountain's wrath, the Hittite weather gods. The Hittites, who forged one of the most powerful empires of the late Bronze Age, were meticulous bureaucrats of the spirit world. They cataloged their deities, counting nearly 1,000 gods of Hatti. This proliferation of divine names was not mere extravagance. It was the ultimate expression of animism's persistence within a great civilization. It meant that every city, every spring, every single majestic mountain possessed its own unique, powerful, and conscious soul. Unlike the predictable generative Ka of the Egyptian Nile, the spirits of the Anatolian plateau were temperamental, formidable, and defined by violent power. It was a land of earthquakes, volcanic peaks, and sudden destructive storms, and the spirits that ruled here were expressions of this volatile geology. The throne of Tarhuna. At the apex of this vast, sprawling pantheon sat the weather god known as Tarhuna, or sometimes Teshub, adopted from the Hurrians. Tarhuna was the supreme lord, the patron of the king, and the ultimate source of life and death. His name itself derives from a root meaning to conquer or to be powerful, signifying that his essence was raw, overcoming force. Tarhuna was the ultimate expression of mountain animism. He did not merely visit the mountains, he lived atop them, and in some cases, he was the mountain. The sacred peak was his throne, his manifestation, the point where the sky's fury met the earth's resilience. In the spectacular rock sanctuary of Yazilikaya, near the capital of Hattusa, we see him depicted not standing on the ground, but atop two powerful personified mountain gods, Namni and Hazi. This image is a spiritual map. The powerful mountains are themselves conscious deities, but they are subordinate to the greater reigning soul of the storm. For the Hittite king, whose very rule was considered a deputy role delegated by the weather god, the mountains were the source of both legitimation and terror. When a storm rolled in, bringing the thunder that was Tarhuna's voice, and the lightning that was his weapon, often depicted as a three-pronged thunderbolt, it was not a natural event. It was the divine personality expressing its mood. The divine disappearance and the return of fertility. The profound anxiety inherent in Anatolian animism centered on the possibility of a god's withdrawal. The most famous of the Hittite myths, the myth of Telepinu, dramatically illustrates this fear of a conscious, offended nature spirit. Telepinu, the son of the weather god, was a deity responsible for crops' fertility and the overall bounty of the earth. One day, Telepinu, perhaps angered by a ritual slight or a human mistake, flew into a great rage. He pulled on his boots, put on his cloak, and disappeared into the wild steppe. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The earth withered. The fields dried up, the grain would not ripen, the sheep and cattle would not conceive, and even the hearth fires went out. All life simply ceased to function. This story is animism, made literal. When the spirit leaves a living thing, the field, the herd, the house, that thing instantly dies. The remaining gods, weakened by hunger, searched desperately, unable to restore the cosmic order or Mayat on their own. It was only after the intervention of a seemingly insignificant creature, the bee, that Telepinu was found sleeping. But even upon awakening, his temper was so great, he had to be calmed, not by strength, but by magic. A human priest eventually performed an intricate expulsion ritual, channeling the god's furious spirit into bronze containers, sunk deep into the earth. This dramatic tale reinforced a core animistic truth for the Hittites. Their massive empire and complex civilization were fundamentally dependent on the mood of the conscious, localized nature deities. The king and his priests had to work constantly to maintain this spiritual equilibrium, offering sacrifices and performing elaborate festivals to keep the souls of the land, the rivers, the storms, the mountains, and the crops performing their assigned necessary functions. The deification of everything. The Hittites elevated this spiritual worldview to an art form recognizing divinity in an astounding range of objects and concepts. Texts frequently mention deified rivers, springs, rocks, and even man-made objects reflecting a thoroughgoing animistic conviction. The divine protective spirit, the Dlama, often a male deity standing on a stag or holding a spear, was believed to indwell certain tree shrines, and most importantly, the king's personal objects. They performed rituals for the divine hearth, the divine doorbolt, and the divine scepter, acknowledging that the function and utility of these items were imbued with a distinct spiritual essence. The Hittite religion, therefore, was less a rigid monotheistic system and more a vast syncretic collection of conscious spiritual forces, a magnificent yet deeply anxious acknowledgement that their entire civilization existed at the mercy of the many souls residing in the rough, dramatic landscape around them. The mountains, silent and looming, were never just rock. They were the very thrones of power. Stone Serpent and sanctuary Minoan Mother Earth. The Minoans flourishing on the island of Crete in the middle of the Bronze Age represented a glorious and distinct expression of animism, one where the entire landscape was perceived as the physical body of a nurturing, powerful, yet ultimately cyclical goddess. Unlike their neighbors in Egypt or Mesopotamia, who built monumental temples for their gods, the Minoans built their grand palaces to integrate with and perhaps serve as an extension of the sacred environment. Their civilization, characterized by vibrant frescoes and a deep respect for the natural world, saw the soul or spiritual essence in three major forms: the mountain peak, the cave, and the creatures that mediated between them, especially the serpent and the bull. The mountain as the goddess's body peak sanctuaries. In the rough central spine of Crete, majestic mountains like Mount Ioctus and Mount Ida were the most sacred sites. The Minoans did not believe a god dwelled in the heavens above the peak. They believed the summit was the god's point of appearance, her very throne, or perhaps her head reclining in sacred rest. These peaks were not chosen arbitrarily. They were places of profound energy transition and breathtaking visibility. Here the Minoans built peak sanctuaries, open-air cult sites often marked by simple stone enclosures or altars. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of votive offerings were deposited, small clay figurines shaped like human bodies, praying figures with their hands clasped to their forehead in supplication, and miniature clay animals, such as goats, cattle, and sheep. These gifts were a spiritual petition, a direct conversation with the Mother of the Mountains, who was the ultimate source of fertility for humans, animals, and the earth itself. By placing a clay rendering of a limb or a whole body in a crevice of the sacred rock, the worshiper made a powerful, localized connection, seeking healing or fertility from the living soul of the mountain. The rituals practiced there were intense and communal. They likely involved ecstatic dance and possibly the ingestion of natural psychoactive substances designed to facilitate a state of trance. The goal was to experience the epiphany, the sudden dramatic appearance of the goddess, often seen in visions descending through the tree canopy or standing flanked by heraldic animals like lions. The Minoan religion was above all a religion of direct sensory experience with the living divinity of the land, the cave portal to the chthonic soul. If the peak sanctuaries represented the high sky-reaching aspect of the goddess, the island's numerous sacred caves represented her dark, chthonic, and regenerative soul. The cave was the ultimate liminal space, the womb of the earth, the source of springs, the home of ancient creatures, and the undeniable entrance to the underworld, where the spirits of the ancestors resided. Caves like the Dictaean Cave were used for centuries, often containing offerings that span the entire sweep of the Minoan era. Rituals performed in these dark, damp spaces were focused on rebirth and prophecy. The cave's dampness and darkness mirrored the state of the soil before planting and the womb before birth. Through libations poured into the ground and rhythmic chanting echoing off the stone, the Minoans sought to draw upon the Earth's raw, potent energy. This dual focus, the high mountain peak and the deep, silent cave, shows that the Minoan view of the soul was utterly cyclical. The spiritual essence ascended at death to the mountain or the sky and descended to the cave, the womb of the earth, to await renewal. The goddess was both the giver of life and the receiver of the dead, the bull, the axe, and the serpent. Two animals dominate Minoan religious art, serving as vital symbols of the island's animistic power, the bull and the serpent. The bull was the manifestation of male vigor, wildness, and potent energy. The dramatic high-stakes ritual of bull leaping Taurokathapsia, depicted in famous palace frescoes, was not simple sport. It was a ritualistic interaction with a sacred animal, possibly a spiritual conquest, or perhaps more likely a rite of passage designed to harness the raw, untamed force of nature. The animal's immense physical power was a vessel for the divine, leading to the use of the horns of consecration, a recurring symbol found atop shrines and temples representing the peak, the horns of the sacrificial beast, and the raw power of the god. The serpent, however, was the mother goddess's most personal attribute. The famous snake goddess figurines found in the palace shrines of Knossos depict women holding snakes in their hands. The serpent, with its ability to shed its skin, represented regeneration, rebirth, and eternal life. Furthermore, as a creature that lives in the earth, it was intrinsically linked to the chthonic power of the underworld and the caves. It was a gentle yet powerful protector of the home and the mysteries of the fertile earth. Through these symbols and sacred places, the Minoans articulated a world where the spiritual and the natural were one. Their civilization was built entirely within the living body of the goddess. They saw not a remote creator, but a direct, palpable presence in the wave of the sea, the crack of the rock, and the rise of the moon, a complete and profound dedication to the consciousness of Mother Earth. The talking oracle and the sacred grove, Greek Dryads and Oreads. As civilization matured, great pantheons arose, Zeus on high, Apollo with his radiant light. But even within the structured anthropomorphic world of the ancient Greeks, the most primeval spiritual layer of animism persisted, clinging to the deepest shadows of the forests and the highest mist-shrouded peaks. The Greeks, though masters of philosophy and architecture, never truly forgot that the world was still alive with thousands of local, conscious, spiritual beings. Their grand temples often stood right next to the sacred grove or the ancient cave, a profound compromise between the new gods of Olympus and the old indwelling spirits of the land, the voices of the wild nymphs and spirits of place. The animistic entities of the Greek world were known collectively as nymphs, beautiful, long-lived, but ultimately mortal female spirits, bound inextricably to a specific location. They were the gentle, localized consciousness of the land, representing the vitality and ephemeral magic of nature. Dryads, or hamadryads, were the souls of the trees, particularly the towering oaks and the shimmering poplars. They were tied to their specific tree. If the tree died, the nymph died with it. To cut down a sacred tree was therefore an act of homicide, inviting terrible, immediate wrath. The forest was not a collection of wood, but a gathering of silent, conscious persons. Oreads were the spirits of the mountains, dwelling in the high, rocky places where the air was thin. They were the shy, protective forces of the remote peaks, similar to the powerful Hittite mountain gods, but often rendered with more grace. Naiads lived in the vital, flowing fresh waters, the springs, wells, and rivers. These were the living voices of the stream, and a community's survival depended on not polluting or angering these essential spirits. The Greek people treated these nymphs not as abstract symbols, but as neighbors whose moods determined their fate. Offerings, a lock of hair, a libation of wine, or a simple garland of wildflowers were left at clearing springs and the bases of great trees, a constant personal acknowledgement of the thousands of subtle souls sharing their space. The Sacred Heart, the Oracle of Delphi. The most spectacular concentration of animistic power in the Greek world was at Delphi, nestled high on the slopes of Mount Parnassus. It was here that the god Apollo established his most famous oracle, the gateway to prophecy. But Apollo did not originally choose this site for its beauty or convenience. He chose it because it was already recognized as the center of the Earth's most potent chthonic and ancient consciousness. According to the myth, before Apollo arrived, the site was guarded by Python, a monstrous earth-dwelling serpent or dragon, the very embodiment of the ancient wild earth soul, or Gaia. Apollo had to slay Python to claim the sanctuary, yet he could never fully exercise the site's primordial spirit. The prophecy at Delphi was delivered by the Pythia, a priestess, who sat on a tripod above a fissure in the rock. Through this fissure, it was believed rose vapors, the literal breath of the Earth's consciousness. The Pythia, inhaling these vapors and entering a trance, spoke the fragmented words of prophecy. This entire practice was an act of applied animism. The Greeks believed that the Earth itself was a conscious being, Gaia, and the chasm was its mouth. The oracle was the human medium, designed to translate the literal prophetic thoughts of the Earth's soul into human language. The site was sacred not because of the temple, but because of the living talking rock. The rituals of transformation. Demeter and the grain animism also persisted in the rituals concerning agriculture. The Eleusinian mysteries centered on the goddess Demeter and her daughter Persephone reveal a profound animistic relationship with the grain and the cycle of harvest. The key mystery revolved around the descent of the daughter into the underworld and her yearly return. The grain seed itself was seen as having a soul which died in the earth, visited the land of the dead, and then was miraculously reborn as the next harvest. This ritual was not merely a celebration of fertility, it was a dramatic participatory empathy with the grain's conscious experience of death and resurrection. By taking part in the secret rites, initiates felt they were sharing in the knowledge of the grain's soul, the promise of cyclical renewal, ensuring that their own souls, like the seed, would not simply vanish, but would be reborn. The fear of the accidental offense. What kept the fear of the nymphs and nature spirits alive was the ever-present danger of unintentional offense. One might inadvertently pollute a Naiad spring or cut down the sacred tree inhabited by a Dryad. A famous Greek tale passed down through generations told of a man who carelessly felled an ancient oak. As the axe bit deep, the Dryad within the tree cried out in agony, and the dying spirit cursed the man's lineage. The fate of the lumberjack was a sharp cautionary message: the world is sentient, and its boundaries must be respected. Every stone, tree, and pool demanded awareness, deference, and the constant recognition of its living, unique soul. In ancient Greece, the glorious marble temples of the Olympian gods commanded respect, but the ancient dark caves in the sun-dappled groves commanded something deeper and far older, a primal, intimate awe of the consciousness that permeated every element of their world. Rome's Numina, the spirit of place and purpose. When Rome was but a cluster of Latin and Sabine villages, long before the thunder of Jupiter echoed across the Mediterranean, its religion was arguably the purest form of practical animism to ever underpin a great empire. The early Romans possessed no grand myths filled with jealous human-like gods. Instead, their spiritual world was inhabited by thousands of formless, functional spiritual essences they called the Numina, plural of Numen. The Numen was not a god in human shape, but the active divine will or power inherent in a specific object, action, or place. The word itself is rooted in the Latin nure, meaning to nod, suggesting a divine assent or sanction. For the early Roman, every successful outcome, a door opening smoothly, grain fermenting into bread, a child drawing its first breath, was due to the quiet, invisible presence of a Numen. The spiritual atomism of early Roman religion was not concerned with belief, but with ritual correctness, pietas. The goal was to maintain the peace of the gods, pax deorum, ensuring that these thousands of functional spirits were correctly acknowledged and appeased. This led to a state of religious atomism, a staggering number of highly specialized spiritual forces governing every conceivable aspect of life. Limentinus was the Numen of the threshold of the house. Cardia presided over the hinges in the opening and closing of doors. Fornax was the spirit that ensured the grain was properly baked in the oven. Robigus was the much-feared spirit of crop blight and rust, who required a specific festival, the Robigelia, to be averted. This profound specialization meant that the early Roman saw the world as a complex machine powered by spiritual energy. To achieve success, one simply had to know which numen governed which function and address it with the precise name and ritual formula. If the name was unknown, one offered a cautious prayer to the numen cuius deum est, the numen to whom this task belongs, the genius and the Juno, the soul of the person. This animistic concept extended to the human individual through the genius for men and the Juno for women. The genius was not merely a guardian angel, it was the divine vital essence of a man's life force specifically associated with his reproductive power and innate capability. A man honored his genius most intensely on his birthday, thanking the spirit that made him himself and ensured the continuation of his line. In art, the genius was often depicted as a snake, the symbol of renewal and chthonic power, or as a young man with his head covered, performing a sacrifice. Similarly, the Juno was the corresponding divine essence tied to a woman's fertility, marriage, and ability to conceive. The head of the family, the paterfamilias, was responsible for the daily cult of his own genius, and the Numina of his household, reinforcing the idea that spiritual responsibility was functional and tied to the person's role in the family and state. The spiritual heart of the home, lares in penitentiam. The most personal and enduring forms of Roman animism were found in the private household, or domus, where the spirits of protection resided in a small shrine called the lararium. The lares. These were powerful guardian spirits. Originally, they may have been spirits of the cultivated field or the crossroads lares compitales. In the home, the lares familiares evolved to become the deified souls of the good ancestors, the spirits of the deceased who chose to remain with the family, watching over their prosperity and daily life. Their presence was a continuous link between the living and the honored dead. The penates. These were the spirits of the penis, the deepest, most secure part of the house where provisions, food, and essential supplies were stored. The penates were literally the deities of the pantry. When a family ate, a portion of the meal was often set aside and burned in the hearth fire as an offering to them, acknowledging that it was the penates who ensured the family always had food and never starved. The lararium was the spiritual nucleus of the home. Often depicted as a colorful fresco panel, it featured the genius or Juno, flanked by two dancing lares with a snake below, a clear daily reminder that the family's health, prosperity, and connection to the ancestors were all guarded by the conscious spirits that permeated every layer of their domestic existence. The assimilation of the Numina. As Rome expanded and interacted with the Greeks and Etruscans, its formless Numina began the dramatic process of anthropomorphism, taking on human shapes and personalities. The original numen of the sky's light and thunder became Jupiter. The numen of the spring and fertility became Juno. But the essence of Roman religion, that every action required the correct ritual to appease the local functional spirit, remained. The vast organized state religion of the later empire was built upon this meticulous, fundamental animistic scaffolding, where the divinity of the thing was more important than the mythology of the god. The Roman genius was their ability to organize the very soul of the world. The blood oath to the bog Celtic animism and offerings. While Roman belief focused on the utility of spiritual function, the Celtic world, stretching across Gaul, Britain, and Ireland, maintained an older, fiercer, and more intimate relationship with the wild landscape. For the Celts, the line between the physical world and the other world was incredibly thin, and the places where these two realms merged were sacred, often terrifying portals. These portals were most frequently found in the turbulent liminal spaces of the natural world, the towering sacred groves Numina, the confluence of rivers, and most dramatically, the desolate, mysterious bog or marshland. To the Celts, every mountain, tree, and river possessed a specific, conscious deity. The goddess of the river, Saint Sequana, was essentially the river itself, revered at its source. The goddesses Bowen and Cianan gave their names and their spirits to the rivers Boyne and Shannon in Ireland. Celtic animism was intensely local, meaning A farmer's primary devotion was to the specific spirit of his spring or forest, clearing the entities who held the power of life healing and fertility in their immediate conscious grasp. The sacred water and the otherworld water was the fundamental currency of this spiritual system. Springs, lakes, and rivers were sacred because they were seen as conduits to the otherworld, the realm of the gods, ancestors, and perpetual vitality. It was in these watery places that the most valuable offerings were made, not merely to appease a god, but to send a gift directly to the spirit realm, ensuring reciprocity. Archaeological finds confirm this powerful tradition. At river sources and in deep lakes, ancient Celts deposited massive amounts of wealth, intricately decorated weapons, cauldrons, jewelry, and shields, often deliberately bent or broken before being thrown in. This act of destruction was not vandalism. It was a ritual of dedication, rendering the object unusable in the mortal realm so that its spiritual essence could be transported whole to the gods in the otherworld. The bog, however, was the most profound, powerful, and mysterious of all sacred watery places. The bog, the ultimate liminal space. The bog was a place of transformation, neither solid earth nor pure water, sitting right on the boundary of existence. Its deep, acidic, oxygen-starved layers were seen as the stomach of the earth goddess, a place where offerings were perfectly preserved and therefore perfectly accepted by the gods. The very act of sinking into a bog was seen as passing to the other world. It is in these sacred bogs, primarily across Britain, Ireland, and Northern Europe, that the most chilling and dramatic evidence of Celtic spiritual devotion is found: the bog bodies. Figures like Lindo Man in England and Old Croghan Man in Ireland, astonishingly preserved by the peat, were not merely victims of ancient murder. Many bore the signs of ritualized multiple forms of death, sometimes referred to by scholars as triple death, such as being struck, garroted, and drowned, suggesting they were highly significant sacrifices intended to satisfy various deities associated with sovereignty, war, and fertility. This dark ceremonial offering to the bog spirits was likely tied to kingship and the fertility of the land. The local king was understood to be ritually married to the land goddess, the sovereignty spirit. If the crops failed or the cattle died, the king had failed his divine consort, threatening the community's existence. By sacrificing a figure of high status, sometimes interpreted as a failed king, a captive, or a high-value victim, and consigning them along with their regalia or ornaments to the bog, the community believed they were giving the highest possible gift of life force to the earth's consciousness in exchange for renewed fertility. The power of the Druids. The spiritual life of the Celts was curated by the Druids, their scholar priests, who were the repositories of religious law and knowledge. They did not preach from temples. They instructed in the Numina, the sacred open-air groves of oak and yew trees. The Druids' power stemmed from their deep esoteric knowledge of the spirits, the unseen connections between the oak and the sky, the mistletoe and the divine essence, and the proper rituals necessary to maintain the delicate blood oath with the conscious forces of the world. The Celtic spiritual landscape was a world of direct dramatic reciprocity. It was one where precious objects and even human life itself were intentionally surrendered to the earth's most powerful spirit portals to ensure that the living consciousness of the land would continue to sustain the people. The blood oath to the bog was the ultimate expression of this fearful, respectful, and intensely practical form of animism. We leave the ritualized, somber bogs of the Celts and move north into the cold, harsh, yet stunningly beautiful world of the Vikings and their ancestors, where animism shaped not only belief but also law. The silent Sentinels. Nordic, Vættir, and land spirits. In the vast, challenging terrain of Scandinavia and the Norse settlements, places like Iceland, where the land constantly steamed with geothermal energy or lay frozen under glaciers, the idea of a unified living earth was not a philosophical concept. It was a daily practical necessity. The people of this world lived in intimate, fearful respect of the Vættir, pronounced Vættir, the generalized Old Norse term for whites or spiritual beings that permeated their cosmos. The Vættir were everywhere, but the most important and numerous were the Vættir, the land spirits. These entities were the localized, protective, and conscious essence of every feature in the Norse environment. They were the silent sentinels whose mood determined whether a farm prospered, a ship sailed safely, or an expedition succeeded. The land is alive, protection, and prosperity. The Vættir were intimately connected to specific geography. They embodied the vitality and character of the place. The Vættir were the spirits of the mountains, looming and ancient. The Vættir guarded the coastlines and the unpredictable sea. Even individual noteworthy rocks, waterfalls, and trees could house a specific potent spirit being, a localized consciousness that demanded constant deference. The Norse worldview demanded reciprocity with these spirits. A farmer would leave offerings, a portion of his meal, a drink of ale, or a cake on a sacred mound, Vættirskjolger or White's Mound, or a special stone not as a bribe, but as a formal act of cooperation with the land. If the spirits were honored, they ensured good harvest, healthy livestock, and protection from misfortune. If they were disrespected, say, by defiling a stream or clearing a sacred grove, they would retaliate with curses, crop failure, or bad luck. The law of the land whites. The reverence for the Vættir was so pervasive and practical that it was written directly into the legal framework of early Norse society, particularly in Iceland's medieval law code, the Grágis Grey Goose laws. This law included a startling and dramatic provision concerning seafaring ships. It stated that no man could approach the shores of Iceland in a ship that carried a terrifying dragon-head, figurehead, Drakahafud, still mounted on its prow. If a ship arrived from a raid or a long voyage, the figurehead, the terrifying glaring dragon or monster, had to be removed before the land came into sight. Why? To avoid frightening the Vættir. The dragon's head was intended to strike fear into human enemies and ward off hostile spirits on foreign shores. But the Norse understood that the local protective spirits of their own land were shy, easily offended, and utterly necessary for the community's well-being. To sail home brandishing a monstrous hostile visage was to risk driving away the Vættir, leaving the land unprotected and vulnerable. This rule is perhaps the single most compelling piece of evidence for the persistence of functional animism in a complex Viking Age society. It shows that the spiritual health of the invisible realm was considered more important than the pride or terror factor of a longship. Jotunheimr, the spirit of chaos in the wild. Beyond the immediate domestic spirits, Norse cosmology was framed by a massive primal form of animism, the existence of the Jötnar, often translated as giants. These were not just large humanoids. They were the personifications of raw, untamed nature and chaos dwelling in the outer realm of Jotunheimr, giant home. The Norse creation myth itself is an ultimate act of animism and deicide. The world was literally formed from the massive conscious body of the first Jotun Ymir. Ymir's flesh became the earth. His bones became the mountains and boulders. His blood became the seas and lakes. His hair became the forests. Thus, every mountain the Norsemen saw, every wave that crashed on the shore was a piece of the Jotun's conscious, chaotic body. The gods Aesir had fashioned the ordered world Midgard from this raw, powerful material. The eternal tension in the cosmos, the storms, the earthquakes, the winter freeze, was the simmering, chaotic residue of the first spirit being that was sacrificed to create the habitable world. The ultimate quest for the Norse was to maintain the boundary, the inner Inngard, against the surrounding, ever-threatening wilderness, the Utgardr, which was the realm of the Jötnar. But even the gods of Asgard, through figures like Thor, were constantly interacting with the Jötnar, acknowledging their raw power and ancient wisdom, for the spirit of the wild was integral to the spirit of life itself. Ancestors in the living earth. Ancient China's Shen and Gui. The Great Yellow River winds its way across the vast land of ancient China, not merely as a waterway, but as a conscious, majestic being. In the eyes of the earliest people who settled along its banks, everything was a dynamic part of a single interwoven system, a vibrant cosmic machine animated by an invisible, powerful life force. Unlike the Siberian hunter who saw the spirit in the reindeer, the ancient Chinese saw the entire cosmos from the smallest pebble to the highest emperor pulsating with a single energy, the qi pronounced qi. This universal qi ensured that the world was never truly empty. It meant that every ancient mountain, every shadowed grove, every bubbling spring, and every ancestral hall was alive, possessed of a consciousness that could influence the living. This belief structured a life lived in constant ritual, a delicate lifelong negotiation with a spirit world far more densely populated than the human one. The most honored souls. The ancestors, the most potent and immediate form of animism in ancient China, was not the worship of a nature god, but the reverence for the ancestors. The family was the central unit of the cosmos, and the line between the living and the dead was incredibly thin, crossed daily by ritual and respect. When an elder, a father, or a mother passed away, their soul did not travel to a distant heaven. It simply moved to the other side of the veil, becoming a Shen, a powerful, benevolent spirit focused entirely on the well-being of their descendants. Imagine a farmer named Jing in the time of the Zhou dynasty. His entire fortune, the health of his crops, the success of his children, the safety of his home depended not on the whims of a distant sky god, but on the contentment of his immediate departed family. He would consult them, constantly burning incense and offering food and wine before a sacred altar in his home. His ancestors were his protectors, his advisors, and his judges. They were the most essential spirits in his world because they were part of his blood, bound to him by an eternal contract of duty and kinship. If Jing was dutiful and respectful, the ancestral Shen would ensure his life was balanced and prosperous. If he neglected the rituals, however, their power could be withdrawn, leaving his family vulnerable to the chaos of the malevolent spirit world. The continuous act of ancestor worship was the ultimate expression of the belief that a human being's consciousness, their soul endured, and remained powerfully active in the world of the living. The two faces of the spirit world. Shen and Gui, the world was formally divided into two categories of non-human spirits. One, the Shen, bright, benevolent spirits. These were the powerful, honored souls, including the ancestors, the gods of the heavens, and the great nature spirits of the living earth. These spirits were associated with light, order, and elevation. The spirit of Mount Tai, the most sacred of the 5 great mountains, was a powerful Shen, a gatekeeper to the afterlife, whose conscious existence dictated the climate and the fate of the lands around it. Offerings and rituals were made to the river spirits to prevent floods, and to the earth spirits to ensure a bountiful harvest. These spirits preferred harmony and would reward those who lived a balanced life. 2. The Gai, dark, malevolent spirits. These were the ghosts, the wandering, unhappy, and often terrifying entities. A Gai was often the soul of someone who had died a premature or violent death, or worse, someone who had been left unburied and forgotten with no descendants to perform the necessary life-sustaining rituals. Without the proper ancestral rites, the soul withered into a chaotic, dangerous entity. To Jing and his neighbors, the world was a high-stakes, dramatic setting where the Shen and the Gai were in constant, if mostly invisible, opposition. The Gai were the source of sudden sickness, bad luck, inexplicable sounds in the night, and failure of the harvest. The entire ritual life of the community was designed to keep the Shen happy, empowered, and therefore strong enough to protect the family from the relentless threat of the chaotic Gai. Every action had spiritual consequence, harmony, geomancy, and the conscious landscape. This animistic view gave rise to some of China's most unique cultural and philosophical practices, most notably feng shui, literally wind water. This was the conscious act of arranging human habitations, homes, tombs, cities in harmony with the flow of qi across the conscious landscape. A master of feng shui could sense where the spirit of the mountain was strongest, where the qi flowed most beneficially, and where the line between the Shen and the Gai was dangerously thin. The placement of a door, the angle of a roof, or the direction a village faced was never arbitrary. It was a conscious conversation with the earth spirit, an attempt to position the human community in a place that would draw power from the benevolent forces of the living land and deflect the harmful influence of the wandering ghosts. The emperor himself stood at the apex of this animistic system. He was the son of heaven, the one designated human who could perfectly bridge the celestial realm of the highest spirits with the earthly realm of man. His rituals were the most vital, for they were offerings to the great spirits of heaven and earth, ensuring that the cosmic order remained in place. If the emperor failed in his duty, if he became corrupt or tyrannical, the spirits would show their displeasure through conscious, deliberate actions, floods, famines, and earthquakes. The natural world, conscious and alive, would rebel, signaling that the emperor had lost the mandate of heaven. In ancient China, life was a continuous ritual dance. It was a philosophy of constant, profound respect, where every tree could hold a spirit, every river flowed with divine intent, and every single soul of a departed relative stood ready, watchful, and powerful. The Chinese cosmos was less a collection of objects and more a family of interlocking souls, where the living held the delicate, vital responsibility of keeping their entire system in perfect spiritual balance. The Serpent's Plumes Animism in Mesoamerica. Our long journey through the night now takes us across the great ocean to a world built high on volcanoes and carved deep in rainforests, the ancient land of Mesoamerica. Here, the animistic vision of the world reached an extraordinary level of complexity and drama, creating a relationship between humanity and nature that was less a simple friendship and more a terrifying, beautiful cosmic contract. For the great civilizations of the Maya, the Zapotec, and the Aztec, the world was not just alive, it was fiercely, hungrily conscious. Every mountain, every stone, every field of maize, and every drop of rain possessed a powerful, often capricious spirit known as a teotl. To live was to be perpetually aware of these forces, and to survive was to constantly feed them. The conscious architecture of the cosmos. Unlike simpler animistic views, the Mesoamerican spirit world was meticulously ordered, structured, and engaged in an eternal high-stakes battle. This spiritual contract centered on a single truth: the sun must move, the rain must fall, and the maize must grow, or the world will end. And to keep these magnificent forces working, they required payment sustenance in the form of precious liquid and human effort. The ultimate symbol of this living cosmos was the feathered serpent, known to the Aztecs as Quetzalcoatl and to the Maya as Kukulkan. He embodies the profound animistic belief that creation is a union of opposites. He is the serpent, the heavy, dense, life-giving earth, and the Quetzal plumes, the light, ephemeral sky, wind, and spirit. Quetzalcoatl was the consciousness of the wind that brings the rain, the inventor of writing that holds memory, and the guardian of the calendar that governs time. He was quite literally the life force of the atmosphere, a deity whose power was felt directly as the cooling breeze swept through the maize fields. When the farmers looked up, they didn't just see clouds. They saw the magnificent plumed coil of the serpent in the heavens, demanding balance in life. The earth devourer. If the feathered serpent was the consciousness of the sky, the true spirit of the land was far more ferocious. The earth itself was known as Tlaltekutli, the earth devourer. This goddess was often depicted as a massive, monstrous amphibian with claws and wide, devouring mouth. Her body was the very terrain upon which they lived. To the Mesoamericans, the earth was not a benevolent mother. It was a hungry monster that constantly needed to be fed to prevent it from swallowing the sun and plunging the world into eternal darkness. Every seed planted, every tree cut, and every life laid to rest was an interaction with this powerful, consuming spirit. The dead were not simply buried in the earth. They were consciously given to Tlaltekutli. This belief created the spiritual necessity of their dramatic rituals. To prevent the world's dissolution, the greatest spirits, the sun, the rain, the earth, required the most precious fluid of all the rhythmic beat of a conscious heart, the inner animal and the nagual. The animistic view also extended to the individual. Just as the tribe had its celestial and terrestrial guardians, every single person had a deep personal connection to the animal kingdom through their nagual or wayab in Mayan traditions. The nagual was a person's spiritual animal companion, or double, typically a jaguar, an eagle, or a serpent born under the same constellation or calendar sign as the individual. This belief meant that the human soul was deeply and permanently linked to the soul of a wild animal. If the animal was wounded, the person would suffer the same injury. If the person died, their spirit would often join the animal's essence. This idea reinforced the sacred status of the jungle and its inhabitants. The jaguars were not just beasts of prey, they were living manifestations of the souls and power of the elite. The simple farmer who shared his soul with a hawk or a deer had an unbreakable spiritual bridge to the power of the wild. To interact with the world of animals was to interact with the spiritual self and the collective consciousness of humanity, the flow of living time. Finally, the calendar itself was a deeply animistic living entity. The Aztecs possessed two synchronized calendars, the 365-day solar year, Xiuhpohualli, and the sacred 260-day divinatory cycle, Tonalpohualli. Every single day in the Tonalpohualli had a unique combination of a conscious number 1 to 13 and a conscious day sign like crocodile, wind, or dog. This meant that every moment was spiritually charged. The forces of the cosmos were constantly flowing, shifting, and influencing destiny. An Aztec priest, a Tonalpukui, was the expert in navigating these conscious time spirits. He did not predict the future. He interpreted the personality of the moment. He could advise a mother not to name her child on a day spirit of ill omen, or a warrior to fight on a day spirit of strength. The Mesoamerican world, then, was a place of dramatic, high-stakes spiritual consciousness. The wind was a great feathered being, the earth was a devouring beast, and time was a constantly moving stream of personalities. The people lived in a constant, beautiful tension, knowing that their careful rituals and their profound respect for the living, breathing environment were the only forces holding the fragile, magnificent world together. The cedar and the sea spirits of the Pacific Northwest. As the currents of time pull us onward, we travel now to a land defined by water and wood, the magnificent misty coastline of North America's Pacific Northwest. This is a world of towering mountains that plunge straight into the cold ocean, where a temperate rainforest stands lush and green all year long. For the indigenous peoples who built their lives here, the Haida, the Tlingit, the Kwakiutl, and others, the spiritual contract was one of deep, abiding respect for the two great conscious forces that govern their existence, the cedar tree and the salmon. In this rich, resource-laden world, the people did not live in fear of a hungry earth devourer or a demanding sun. Instead, they lived in a constant reciprocal relationship with the generous spirits of their natural environment. Everything they needed was a gift, and every gift required careful, ritualized thanks. The mother of the people. If the Nile was Egypt's mother, the Great Red Cedar was the mother of the Northwest coast. These immense trees growing for centuries were regarded not just as wood, but as conscious spiritual entities whose bodies provided everything necessary for life. When a builder or carver approached a cedar, it was a moment of prayer and ritual. The person would sing to the tree, explaining why its life was needed to become a canoe to feed the family or a plank for the longhouse. The spirit of the tree had to willingly consent to this sacrifice. Nothing was wasted. The bark was used for clothing and rope. The wood was carved into tools boxes and massive houses. The spirit of the tree, now living in the house or boat, continued to serve and protect the family. Even the monumental totem poles, the greatest artistic expression of this culture, were fundamentally about the cedar spirit. The pole was not simply an art object, it was the house of a family's history and a physical manifestation of their spiritual inheritance. The animal figures carved upon it, the raven, the bear, the killer whale, were the ancestral spirits who had gifted the family with their lineage and their power. By raising the pole, they created a powerful, visible link between the human world and a sacred consciousness embodied in the cedar wood. The chief of the undersea world. The other great spiritual force was the salmon. The annual return of the salmon run from the sea was not an ecological event. It was a miraculous visit from a conscious foreign civilization, the undersea people. The salmon were considered noble, generous beings who every year voluntarily transformed themselves into fish to sacrifice their bodies to the human world, ensuring the people's survival. This concept created one of the most solemn and beautiful rituals of reciprocity. When the first salmon of the season was caught, it was treated with the highest honor. The chief would perform an elaborate first salmon ceremony. The fish was carefully prepared, shared and consumed by the entire community. Crucially, every single bone and scrap was meticulously collected and returned to the river, tossed back into the flowing water with prayers of gratitude. The belief was that the bones would then reform and the spirit of the salmon would travel back to the chief of the undersea world. When the spirit returned and reported that the humans had shown proper respect and gratitude, the undersea people would consent to return again the following year. If the humans were greedy, wasted the flesh, or failed to return the bones, the salmon would be insulted, and the run would cease, resulting in famine. The ritual was the maintenance of a literal life-or-death spiritual contract. Wealth and the spirit of giving. This culture's animistic view of the world also transformed the very idea of wealth. In most societies, wealth is measured by what you keep. For the Northwest Coast people's true spiritual wealth was measured by what you gave away. This principle found its expression in the potlatch. The potlatch was not just a feast. It was a grand spiritual ceremony, an extravagant public ritual of giving designed to honor spirits, ancestors, and guests. A chief would accumulate immense quantities of wealth, carve mass, blankets, food, and copper shields only to distribute it all to his guests. By giving away wealth, the chief was demonstrating a profound spiritual confidence. He was so favored by the salmon and the cedar spirits that his spiritual contract guaranteed he would always receive more. The act of giving was a form of spiritual combustion, creating more life, more energy, and more prestige for the entire lineage. Through their reverence for the cedar, their gratitude to the salmon, and their practice of giving, the people of the Pacific Northwest created a world where nature was not a thing, but a vast, generous, and wise family living in a perfect, continuous cycle of life, death, and spectacular return. The Whispering Stream, Spirits of Japan. Our journey across the map of the ancient spirit world is coming to a close. For our final moment of pause, we travel to a place where the ancient ways were never truly forgotten, where the conversation between humans and nature continues today with meticulous care and profound reverence, the islands of Japan. Here, the core principle of animism, that the world is alive, is not merely history, it is a vital living faith known as Shinto. In the Shinto view, the world is populated by countless kami. The word kami is often translated as God, but it is much broader. It means a conscious spirit, a natural power, or a sacred essence. Kami are not housed only in distant heavens. They dwell intimately in the great cedar trees, the rushing waterfalls, the smooth river stones, and the towering mountains that shape the land. The land of countless kami. To the Japanese, the landscape is a living tapestry woven with spiritual forces. A rock wrapped in a sacred straw rope. Shimenawa is not just geology, it is a recognized kami. The deep ancient forests are filled with spirits that must be approached with caution and respect. The entire culture is built upon the premise that humanity must exist in harmony with these powerful localized forces. This belief demands absolute purity. Before entering a sacred space or jinja dedicated to a kami, you must pass through the Torii Gate, which is the boundary between the mundane human world and the sacred spirit world. Then you must perform ritual purification, washing your hands and rinsing your mouth, a symbolic act of removing the dust of the everyday world and preparing yourself to stand in the presence of a powerful, clean energy. This attention to detail reflects the continuous dialogue required to maintain harmony with the conscious forces of the land. The grandest example of this reverence is Fujisan Mount Fuji. This volcano is viewed as the ultimate earth kami, a living, breathing spiritual presence that towers over the landscape. For centuries, pilgrims have climbed its slopes as a spiritual journey, believing they are ascending into the realm of the pure spirits. The mountain is seen not as an inert mass of rock, but as a vast, powerful entity whose temper dictates the fate of the land around it, the ancestral contract and the sacred hearth. Just as Animism sees a conscious soul in the rock, it also sees a conscious, continuing presence in the ancestors. In the Japanese home, this ancestral reverence blends seamlessly with the worship of nature spirits. The most important place in the traditional home is the kamidana, the shelf of kami. Here the ancestors are honored alongside small, simple objects representing the great spirits, a token from the great Isa shrine, representing the sun goddess Amaterasu, or a simple offering to the rice god for a good harvest. Every morning the family bows, claps their hands to wake the spirits and offers a prayer. This daily ritual is the living contract acknowledging that the energy that sustains the family, the food, the luck, the long life comes not just from human effort, but from the continuous active benevolence of both the dead and the natural world. The Isa Grand Shrine, the most sacred site in Shinto, perfectly captures the animistic connection to time and nature. The main shrine building is ritually torn down and rebuilt every 20 years on an adjacent plot of land. This practice is not about architectural permanence. It is a ritual of death and rebirth, ensuring that the spiritual energy remains pure and constantly renewed. It reminds the people that power lies not in the static stone, but in the sacred cycles and the continuing spirit of the wood itself. The calming whisper, the wind down. And so we must now come to the end of our journey, closing the book on these many whispers of conscious worlds. The hunter in Siberia who offered the deer's bones to the returning spirit. The Egyptian who threw a sacred scroll to the flowing heart of the Nile. The Greek who revered the stone as a portal to the gods. The Mesoamerican who saw the wind as the feathered serpent. And the Japanese who bows before a rock wrapped in a sacred rope. All of them shared one simple, profound truth, that we are not alone. That the vast, complex, beautiful world around us is not merely background scenery, but a family of conscious forces. They remind us that the wind is listening, the stream is watching, and the mountain has a long, patient memory. As you drift now, feel the quiet consciousness of your own space. The ceiling above you holds the stillness of the air. The frame of your bed holds the spirit of the wood. The quiet rhythm of your own breath is the most profound contract of all, a gentle agreement between the sleeping mind and the waking world. There is no need to worry about what lies outside the window, for the world is aware, watchful, and deeply patiently safe. Rest easy now. The spirits of the stone and the stream will watch over your journey through the night. Good night.